Off we head down to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where waiting on the phone for us patiently is from Wyoming Liberty Group, Boyd Wiggum. Boyd, you were supposed to do homework and bring us a list of topics today. Did you do that, or do I send you to the woodshed?
Well, today I think we're going to talk a little bit about smart growth and
smart growth.
How it kind of gets property rights and really hurts Wyomingites.
Okay, now, and just so you know, Boyd, we've picked up some stations that are even further east from here in South Dakota now. And so just to keep in mind, it's not just Wyoming that you're talking to. Smart growth, no matter what community you're in, is a property rights issue. But let me add one more thing to it, though. In fact, let me ask you. Does this have anything to do with the Agenda 21 that's been pushed into this area?
When we hear about Agenda 21, that, of course, is a non-binding agreement that got signed back in the early 90s.
Right.
But smart growth really captures the real policies that even predated the whole Agenda 21 thing that seem to be alive and well even in our more freedom-loving, property rights-oriented communities.
See, well, I asked that because to me, whenever I hear about smart growth and then I hear about Agenda 21, a lot of times I feel like I'm reading the same news, the same reports, the same ideas.
Well, there's some folks from Heritage Group that would argue that yes, you do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
When these folks dug into the notions of smart growth and, of course, Agenda 21 that I'm less concerned about. Messrs. Cox, Utt, and Schaefer point out that Agenda 21 is not this big UN thing that's attacking the U.S. Agenda 21 grew out of smart growth ideas that from the 70s and 80s that grew up in and around the U.S.
Okay.
And there's some good sounding things about smart growth.
Right.
Around here, we call it growth on our own terms.
Yeah, well, it sounds to me like the same. The reason why I think the two are also very similar when you read them is because it's basically the same people in the same groups pushing the same ideas. And so that's why it sounds so similar. Am I right about that?
I believe so. It's the same ideas, just a different audience, different vehicle. And while Agenda 21 is some pie in the sky thing that came out of the UN, smart growth really does hit home and has real effects. And we see it down here around Cheyenne, and I believe many communities see it and think of it as something that was reflective of their own ideas of growth on their own terms.
Before we get into this, let me set up one more thing with you here. See, I have no problem. I'm fascinated by magazines, in fact, that show better, more efficient ways of using your land, using your property, getting things done. I'm always fascinated by new technology and just new ideas on how to do things. So whenever someone comes up with a better idea, please show it to me, and if I like it, I'll adopt it. So are you talking about something that takes that last part away? If I like it, I'll adopt it? In other words, I just have to adopt it?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more the way these ideas are packaged, and there's some good nuggets in the smart growth ideas. Trying to get more bang for the buck on basic infrastructure like water, sewer, streets. But there's also a stick that gets well hidden, and that's the idea that I think lays at the back of the environmental movement's leadership on these issues, and that is to restrict new growth, new housing at the periphery of towns and cities. And that's where it really bites the pocketbooks of just ordinary Americans trying to live day to day and pursue the American dream.
Okay, now before we get into details, and I know you have some details for me on smart growth, let's take the opposite side of that, because I bet if I said I had some problems with smart growth, there are some people that I debate and argue with who immediately say, well, we need to have some kind of zoning, we need to have some kind of rules, you're against all zoning and all rules, and that would be just total mayhem. And I said, well, I didn't go that far either. So
yeah, and the issue with smart growth is not so much the what it allows, but it's kind of what it restricts.
Right.
And like I said, that has to do with trying to actually force people into the center of communities, trying to restrict the development of new single-family detached houses with a yard and a swing set and maybe a white picket fence even, because the folks that are behind this really don't want to see cities and communities expand outward,
right.
Regardless of what people want. I mean, any kind of good approach to public policy needs to leave open the possibility of a full range of choices.
Mm-hmm.
Smart growth focuses on opening up more choices for people who do want to live in the interior communities, infill development, apartments, walkable type neighborhoods. But the problem with the smart growth approach is it also tries to restrict the ability of people to choose the alternative that I personally like. I have 3 young children, and I do want a yard with a fence around it with a little bit of space for them to play right there where my wife and I can keep an eye on them.
Yeah. Well, see, growing up in Florida, there's a lot of neighborhoods, which are private neighborhoods, and they proudly say right on the front gate, a planned community. Mm-hmm. Now, understand, if you decide to buy a house in a planned community, you're not going to be able to buy that house until you sign this big, thick booklet of all of the restrictions saying that you understand that this is how your house is going to look, this is how your yard is going to look, this is how late you're allowed to have your lights on at night, and on and on and on it goes. But you make the choice to live under those rules, and actually some people like that. They like the structure of it. Then there's people like me, hey, give me a place that I can call my own and I'll do what I want with it. Now, I'm the opposite end of that. So we should have the choice, but are we talking about, let's say, city rules or county rules where the people don't have a choice?
Yes, okay. More like that. It would be taking these ideas and superimposing them on existing communities. Like, for example, taking the approach that new development at Gillette should be compact, as opposed to letting you choose between a larger and small lot. Letting you choose between a townhouse or an apartment, or a 2,000 or 3,000 foot house if you so choose, with a little bit of acreage.
Yeah.
The idea is to take that latter example off the table and create a situation where any new housing growth would look more like the first two, an apartment or a townhouse.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes you wind up in a situation like Savannah, Georgia, one of the original 13 colonies. And oh, dear Lord, you want to talk about some historic old architecture that they are very proud of. So if you go and buy a home, especially near the downtown area in Savannah, Georgia, understand, even if you want to, and I'm very serious about this, you want to change a doorknob in your house, it has to be approved by the Historic Society. But then again, people who live there tend to like the historic nature of it. Now, the Reason Foundation, though, recently just did a very interesting video on New York City and how New York was constantly growing and changing, was very modern, until the Historic Society came along, and now all sorts of new buildings and modern architecture and modern conveniences have been put to a halt, and the city has become stagnant because not just smart growth, but no growth. You have to keep it looking historic and old.
Yeah, I need to look at that. That sounds
I'll send it to you.
Kind of interesting.
It's a fascinating video.
I know the idea of preserving the appearance of historic structures in New York City. In fact, it was Penn Station gave rise to one of the most significant zoning and regulatory takings cases in U.S. jurisprudence. But that's enough material buried in that case to last for 3 shows.
Well, can you, and since you're in Cheyenne, in that area, cite an example of smart growth that you have a problem with?
Here's what drew my attention to smart growth. Down here in Cheyenne, a lot of these smart growth ideas, or the values that are part of smart growth, the idea of limiting investment in new infrastructure and trying to manage the rate of population growth in the community to keep it looking like it used to look, falls into the kind of gets described as growth on our own terms, and it was kind of a keep the outsiders out. Let's try to stay small, stay like a hometown community that I remember from the time I was in college. It's just kind of been a theme that's a part of many of our election cycles down here, and I think we can even recognize some of that from some of the statewide discussions here, and even communities in the western part of the Great Plains, in western Nebraska, western South Dakota. There's this value that, hey, this is our home. We don't want outsiders coming in and changing it. And as a result, there's a resistance to investing in more roads, paving at the periphery, extending water and sewer lines, because, that just, it costs money. And that is important. It's taxpayer money. We really don't want to have to pay for that. Let the new people pay for it. But the end result is a problem that I know, folks up around coal country, up there around you, around coal country and around Casper and down here face, and that is you run into a housing shortage. Mm. Housing becomes scarce. Housing becomes less affordable. And the follow-on consequence of that people run into, and was part of the discussion earlier this week that I attended, was that employers then can't even get enough warm bodies to fill their jobs. And that's kind of the pernicious, unspoken impact of smart growth policies, is this idea that, if we can, limit new growth on the periphery, if we can limit any new housing to infill highly, dense housing in the middle of town, then yes, housing prices go up, but you limit growth, you limit new economic activity, and I guess by extension, if you can't hire miners to dig the coal out of the ground, then that's one way to squelch coal production. But that's what we run into, and certainly down here in Cheyenne, we now have a housing shortage, and we have a housing affordability problem. And in my conversations around the area, into northern and western Wyoming and central Wyoming, this is not an uncommon problem, at least in the places I've visited with.
All right.
To the show. Back to Glenn Woods.
This is the pasty white guy talking to the other pasty white guy down in Cheyenne. I bet you and I haven't seen the sunshine in a long time, Boyd. How's the weather down there?
Oh, we're finally getting hints of sunshine, and it looks like the plants around are finally getting a little bit excited about it. Possibility of spring eventually.
Yeah, real live water. Okay, so let me ask you this. We got about 6 minutes left. Now, for those just joining us, we're talking about smart growth, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. So let me ask you this on smart growth. We have to, I would think, draw the line somewhere. I mean, it's always good to have a few rules as we play this little game of what's supposed to be capitalism in a country that used to be capitalist. And yes, Boyd, I'm very cynical about that. So there's always some rules of the game. But where do you draw the line on restrictions and people's property rights? Because, I mean, is it blurred for you? Or is it very clear?
It can get a little bit tricky when you start talking about where private property rights come into contact with public policy and public investment, public infrastructure. In particular, when you start talking about extending infrastructure beyond the current footprint. And I believe that's why property rights advocates in our region we're willing to adopt policies that we now recognize were inspired by the environmental smart growth movement years and years ago. And part of that is, the democratic process. We do elect people to spend and invest our tax money wisely to protect and preserve property rights and life and health and safety. So there is that element there. But one of the touchstones to me is if local government has policies that we eventually learn aren't able to be sufficiently nimble to react to market realities such as job growth, population growth, perhaps a new technology like fracking that reinvigorates an economic boom here in Wyoming, then we can't just dig in our heels and say, I don't care what the market says, we are going to stick with our slow growth approach and whatever happens, happens. At the end of the day, in my mind, state and local government needs to be the servant of the people who live here and the property owners and the investors in any of our states, rather than the other way around.
Right. Now, in some places, I recently was in a discussion with some people in Reno, Nevada, on a Reno, Nevada television station, and they have a problem with an airport that's been there for a while, but because of FAA safety rules, they changed the flight pattern going in and out of the airport, which means a neighborhood underneath all of a sudden is putting up with all of this noise. And so I can understand whether, let's just for the fun of it, say it was a private airport. I can understand saying, well, we don't want to locate this too close to that because there tends to be conflicts and problems when you do. So what do you think about a city coming along and saying, this is going to be the industrial side and this is going to be the residential side? Should they zone that or should they just leave it up to the market?
The notion behind zoning was a way to prevent economic waste. Once upon a time, before we went crazy, the basic underlying premise was that there are things such as private nuisances, certain things that one property owner might do on property that would be just illegal, would violate the property rights of an adjacent landowner or a nearby landowner. And that kind of is rooted in the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And so that is the underlying premise behind allowing zoning as being something that's constitutional, because up until about 1924, there wasn't even any real certainty whether or not local zoning laws were constitutional.
Right.
And your airport example kind of gets to that extreme situation a little more than some of these growth controls that we're talking about here with smart growth that are really geared at trying to prevent a pasture at the edge of town from being a future neighborhood.
Right.
Yeah, and those are two entirely different things.
It can get difficult, especially because what originally was set up will change over time. And some of the changes, Boyd, I don't think we're going to see as coming because, technology changes and our world changes and all of a sudden we have problems we didn't anticipate. Where can people follow your work?
We are at www.wyliberty.org.
Mm-hmm. All right, Boyd, as always, thanks for coming on. Very informative, a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Have a good day.